In the land of our ancestors, where the baobab tree remembers every secret whispered beneath its branches, and the evening fire gathers the old and the young alike, there lived a woman. Her name was Adais, and Adais, my people, was the laziest woman in all the land. Not just in her village, not just in her district. Some said if you searched from the mountains of the east to the rivers of the west, every morning, when the rooster crowed and the women of the village rose before the sun, fetching water from the river, pounding yam, sweeping compounds, blowing life into dying coals, Adais would hear the rooster, roll over, pull her wrapper tighter around her shoulders, and go back to sleep. She had been this way since she was a small girl. Her mother had warned her. Her grandmother had warned her. The aunties had taken turns scolding her, dragging her by the arm to help with one chore or another. But Adais had a gift that was almost admirable if it wasn't so frustrating. She had the most gifted tongue in the village. She could talk her way out of any task ever placed before her. If you asked her to fetch water, her wrist was paining her. If you asked her to sweep, her back had been troubling her. If you asked her to cook, she had a headache that started just that morning, that sometimes even the person asking would feel guilty for having disturbed her rest. She married a man named Emeka. Now, Emeka was the kind of man that mothers pointed to when they wanted to show their daughters what a good husband looked like. He was hardworking, patient, and quiet in the way that deep rivers are quiet, full of movement underneath, but calm on the surface. He farmed from before sunrise until after sunset. His hands were calloused and strong. His heart was even stronger. When Adais refused to fetch water, Emeka fetched it himself after returning from the farm. When Adais said she was too tired to cook, Emeka cooked, exhausted, dirty from the fields, still in his farming clothes, because someone had to eat and someone had to feed the household. When the compound went unswept for 3 days, and the neighbors began to talk, Emeka swept it on a Sunday morning without a single word of complaint. The village had a saying about him. They said, "That man married a queen but received no palace." People pitied Emeka. The women whispered about Adais at the river. The men shook their heads when they saw him carrying water. The older men cautioned their sons, pointing to Emeka's compound as an example of what happens when a man does not look carefully before he chooses. But Emeka never shouted. He never raised his hand. He never stood in the middle of the compound and disgraced his wife. He simply worked, and pride, and waited, because his grandmother had told him when he was just a boy, patience is the elder brother of wisdom. And she fanned herself under the mango tree, and she spoke constantly and beautifully about all the wonderful things she was going to do tomorrow. Tomorrow, she would clean the entire hut. Tomorrow, she would go to the market and cook a feast. Tomorrow, she would rise early and fetch the water herself and do everything that a proper wife should do. Tomorrow never came. Years passed this way. The compound stayed half-kept. Emeka stayed tired. Then one dry season, everything changed. The dust on the road into the village announced her before she arrived. A woman walking with her chin held high, her wrapper tied firmly at the waist, her eyes moving across everything like a market woman counting her stock. This was Mama Ngozi, Emeka's mother, come all the way from the eastern village to visit her son. Now Mama Ngozi was not just any woman. She was known across 7 villages as a woman who had built her own life from almost nothing. After her husband died young, she had raised 6 children alone, farmed her own land, traded at the market every week without fail, and once argued with a government officer so thoroughly and so precisely that he packed up his papers and left the village in embarrassment. She was sharp. She was experienced, and she had not raised a son to suffer quietly in his own compound. When Mama Ngozi walked into Emeka's yard and saw the unwashed pots near the doorway, the broom leaning untouched against the wall since morning, the heap of dirty fabric in the corner that had clearly been there for several days, and then saw Adais lying on her mat in the middle of the afternoon. Not asleep, just resting from her rest. Something moved behind her eyes. She said nothing immediately. She greeted Adais warmly. She accepted the water Emeka had fetched and the soup he had made. She smiled and asked after everyone's health. She was the perfect guest. But that night, after Adais had gone to bed early as usual, Mama Ngozi sat with her son by the dying fire and spoke to him in the quiet, deliberate way of a woman who has already made up her mind. She told him, "You cannot beat laziness out of a person. You cannot shame it out of them, or pray it out of them, or beg it out of them. But you can make laziness so deeply uncomfortable that the lazy person decides on their own that work is the better option." Emeka listened, and a slow smile crossed his tired face for the first time in a long while. The next morning, before Ades had even stirred, Mama Ngozi was already in the kitchen, but she was not cooking. She was reorganizing. She moved every pot, every ingredient, every utensil to a different place. The salt went where the pepper usually sat. The cooking oil was placed in a new corner. The firewood was stacked in a way that only she understood. The pounded yam that was usually stored in the clay pot by the door was now in a different clay pot entirely, placed near the back wall, under a cloth. Then Mama Ngozi came out of the kitchen, sat down in the most comfortable chair in the compound, the very chair Ades used every afternoon, and she began to rest. When Ades finally emerged, stretching wrapper loose around her shoulders, expecting to find her chair empty and her morning free, she found Mama Ngozi sitting in her spot with the peaceful expression of a woman who had already done 3 hours of work and had earned her rest completely. Ades smiled politely and went inside to find something to eat. She opened the clay pot by the door. Empty. She looked for the makras to start a fire, gone from the usual hook on the wall. She searched for the pepper. Nowhere. She stood in the middle of the kitchen in growing confusion, touching things and finding nothing where it should be. After several minutes, she came outside. She asked, very politely, where things were. Mama Ngozi looked up with white, innocent eyes. "Oh," she said. She had done a little tidying that morning. Everything was still there, just in better order now. She offered to show Ades where things were, but first, her knees were a little sore from all the early morning work, and she just needed a few more minutes in the chair. Ades waited. Mama Ngozi did not move. Ades waited longer. Mama Ngozi closed her eyes. Eventually, Ades, hungry and frustrated, went back into the kitchen and began searching herself. She found the yam flour after 10 minutes of looking. She found the pot after 5 more. By the time she located the firewood and arranged it and got the fire going, she had already done more physical work in one morning than she had done in the past 2 weeks combined. And here is what nobody tells you about lazy people. They're not without ability. They're simply without motivation. The moment Ades was forced to move, she moved. The moment she was forced to search and find and arrange and cook, she did all of those things. Poorly at first, and with much muttering under her breath, but she did them. Mama Ngozi watched all of this from her comfortable chair and said nothing. She accepted the food Ades cooked that afternoon with great warmth and praised her loudly. Ades, who had never once been praised for cooking in her own compound, stood very still for a moment. Something unfamiliar moved in her chest. The next day, Mama Ngozi did the same thing. She woke before anyone and rearranged something. She took the best resting spot. She made a day's move to find what she needed, and again she praised her at the end of the day. On the third day, Mama Ngozi sat Ades down and spoke to her, not like a mother-in-law, not like an elder, but like a woman speaking to another woman. She told her about her own life. She described the years after Ramaka's father died, when she had 6 small children and empty hands and a compound that needed keeping, and no one to help her do it. She described the first time she felt the pride of doing something hard and doing it well. She said that pride, that feeling no man could give it to you and no rest could give it to you. Only work could give it to you. Only the kind of tiredness that comes from building something, making something, feeding someone, only that tiredness feels like rest. Ades listened without speaking for the first time anyone could remember. When Mama Ngozi finished, she stood up, tied her wrapper firmly at the waist, and said, "Now come, let us cook together." And Ades, this woman who had refused to lift a finger for years, who had excused herself from every task, who had mastered the art of beautiful excuses, Ades stood up. She tied her own wrapper, and she followed. That was the beginning. It did not happen overnight. There were mornings still when Ades moved slowly. There were days when the old habits tugged at her like a familiar chair, but something had broken open in her. some understanding of what she had been costing herself all those years. Not just her husband, not just her compound, but herself. By the time Mama Ngozi prepared to return to the eastern village, the compound was clean. The fire was lit by Aggie's hand every morning. The water was fetched. The food was cooked, and Emeka, who had been quietly tired for years, began to come home in the evenings and find something waiting for him. A meal. A swept yard. A wife who looked him in the eyes with something new in her expression. Not shame, not guilt. Pride. The village noticed. Of course they noticed. Villages always notice. The women at the river began to include Ades in their conversations again. The older women nodded at her as she passed. Even the village elder, old Baba Chukimika, paused when he saw her one morning carrying a water pot on her head and simply said, "A person who changes is braver than a person who was never wrong." On the morning Mama Ngozi left, Ades rose before sunrise and prepared a full meal for the road. She packed it herself, wrapped it in cloth, tied it properly, and placed it in Mama Ngozi's hands at the gate. The two women looked at each other. Mama Ngozi smiled. Not the sharp smile from that first day, a real one. She said, "I did not come to fight you, my daughter. I came because my son loves you, and because I could see what you were capable of even when you could not see it yourself." Adea said nothing, but her eyes were full. She stood at the gate and watched Mama Ngozi walk away down the dusty road, until she was only a small figure of purple and gold disappearing into the morning. Then she turned back to her compound. Compound. She looked at the swept yard, the tidy doorway, the smoke already rising from the kitchen fire, and she went inside to begin her day. Because that is the lesson the ancestors have always known. Laziness is not who a person is, it is only what a person is doing until they meet their match. And sometimes your match does not arrive to defeat you. Sometimes they arrive to wake you up. That is the story of a day. Remember it well.